Everyone who knew me before the architects arrived will tell you I was trying to leave. That's true. I want to be clear about that before I tell you anything else. I was not a reluctant hero. I was not secretly brave, waiting for something worth fighting for. I was a man who had filed the paperwork, passed the physicals, and signed a contract that said in plain language that I would never come home. The program was called Exodus Initiative. They had a website, a logo, a stylized rocket curving away from a blue marble. I had a laminated badge with my name on it and a projected departure date of March 14th, 7 years from the day I signed. I had told my father. I had told my mother. I had told my sister Liz, who called me an idiot and drove 4 hours to say it to my face. I had made my peace with all of it. Then the architects came, and the whole question of leaving became a great deal more complicated. I want to start with the farm, because the farm is where everything that matters actually happened. We grew flowers. That sounds simple. It isn't. Flowers are one of the more demanding crops a person can work, particular about soil acidity, about drainage, about the difference between morning light and afternoon light, about temperature swings of 3 degrees in either direction. My father, Jeff McAllister, had been working that land for 31 years. He knew it the way some men know a language, not by rule but by feel, by the small daily accumulation of attention. He could walk a row of Ecuadorian roses in September and tell you, without pulling a sample, exactly which plants were going to fail before Christmas. He was not a man who said much. He didn't need to. The land said it for him. My mother Jane ran the books, handled the buyers, navigated the supply chain, and kept my father from going entirely silent. She was a quiet woman with a very precise sense of what was worth worrying about and what was not. After Tom died, that sense became even more precise. She cut everything down to the minimum. She cooked. She walked the property line each morning. She held my father's hand at the kitchen table in the evenings and did not say the things that would have been too large to say. Tom was my brother, my twin. He died 11 months before the architects made their first contact. I'm not going to dwell on that because this story isn't about Tom, except that it is, in the way that all of it is, the leaving, the staying, the fighting. Tom is the load-bearing wall in the middle of everything I did and everything I failed to do, and I will not pretend otherwise. Liz had driven back from the city when Tom died and never quite made it all the way back. She told her clients she was handling a family situation. She told herself she'd leave again in a month. She was still there when the architects arrived. She was working the greenhouse by then, because someone had to, and because pulling dead stalks out of potting trays turned out to be something her hands could do while her mind went wherever it needed to go. She was not a farmer. She was too precise, too efficient, too prone to reading the agricultural extension bulletins and then reorganizing the whole operation based on them. But she kept things alive, and that was what mattered. Dimitri was the farmhand. He had been with us 6 years, arriving one spring with a single bag and references from a grower in the Central Valley, and staying because he was good at the work and because my father, without ever saying it, needed someone capable of plain conversation. Dimitri was from somewhere in Eastern Europe. He never specified and we never pushed, and he had a way of looking at problems sideways that I came to rely on more than I ever told him. And there was Dr. Sue Olson, who ran the county extension office and had been advising my father on soil remediation for 2 years. She drove out every other Tuesday in a green pickup truck, walked the rows with him for an hour, drank 1 cup of coffee at the kitchen table, and drove back. She was the kind of person who knew exactly how much the world could be improved by calm, thorough attention, and had decided to spend her life proving it. That was us. The McAllister Flower Farm, upstate New York, late October, roughly 14 months before the architects finished building their first stabilization array, and the sky turned the color of old copper. I should explain what the architects are, or at least what we understood them to be in those early months. They were not invaders in any sense we had prepared for. They did not arrive with warships. They did not broadcast demands. The first sign was geological, a pattern of subsurface vibrations that seismologists flagged as anomalous, running in precise hexagonal grids across 6 continents simultaneously. Then came the structures. They grew from the ground, or from somewhere beneath the ground, rising over a period of weeks. Dark latticework spires, each one between 40 and 90 meters tall, composed of a material that the first analysis teams identified as neither mineral nor manufactured but something in between, a structured silicon compound with internal channels that pulsed at frequencies below human hearing. They rose in patterns, always in patterns. One researcher at JPL, before communications became unreliable, published a paper arguing that the grid corresponded to optimal heat dissipation geometry for a planet being prepared for a change in atmospheric composition. She was right, we know that now. The architects themselves were not seen for a long time. What was seen were the effects, the way the air near the spires made your eyes water, the way radio signals degraded within 2 kilometers of any structure, the way animals avoided the areas entirely and moved in anxious, purposeless herds toward the coasts, the way crops planted within 5 kilometers of a spire produced nothing, soil chemistry altered in ways the extension bulletins had no category for. The way, by late winter, the color of the sky near the spires had shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily from blue to a washed-out pale violet that made everything under it look slightly wrong. The military response was immediate and entirely ineffective. I will not detail what was tried, because the details do not serve the story, and because some of the men who tried those things did not come back, and they deserve better than to be footnotes in my account. What I will say is that ordnance had no meaningful effect on the spires, that close approach operations resulted in total equipment failure within range, and that the one time a manned unit reached physical contact with a structure, the 5-man team was found 2 days later, alive and unharmed, with no memory of the preceding 48 hours and a persistent inability to smell anything for the rest of their lives. The architects were not trying to kill us. That was perhaps the most unsettling thing. They were simply changing the planet, adjusting the chemistry, the temperature profile, the atmospheric composition, the way a farmer might adjust the soil. They were not hostile. They were just indifferent in the way that a glacier is indifferent to what it moves through. We understood by spring that if the process completed, the air would no longer support human respiration, not through violence, just through change. The way a house becomes uninhabitable when the foundation shifts, no malice, just physics. This is what I was running toward when I signed with the Exodus Initiative. Not cowardice. I want to be clear about that too. I understood the situation. I understood what staying meant. I had calculated, with the cold precision of a man who has nothing left to lose on the surface of a world, that departure was the rational choice. I was 29 years old, I had a science background, I was physically fit, and I had a brother who was dead and a farm that was dying and a program that said there was somewhere else to go. I did not factor in Daisy Taylor. She arrived in town the same week. The second cluster of spires came up along the ridge to the northeast, close enough that we could see their tops from the upper greenhouse on a clear morning. She had been a competitive swimmer in another life, had left that, had worked insurance, had left that too, and was renting the Kaufman place at the end of Route 9 for reasons she kept vague in the careful way people do when the reasons are something they haven't finished working through. She came by the farm stand on a Thursday afternoon and bought 3 bundles of late-season dahlias and asked my father about the spires on the ridge. My father told her they were government atmospheric monitoring stations. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at me. "Right," she said, and paid for the dahlias. She came back the following Tuesday with a pie and the observation that the dahlias had lasted 5 days in the vase, and she wanted to know what we were doing differently from the commercial operations. This was the kind of question my father would normally answer for 20 minutes without stopping. Instead, he nodded once, handed her a cup of coffee, and left the kitchen. Which meant that Daisy Taylor and I sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours while she asked me about flowers, and I told her things I had not told anyone in 11 months. And at the end of it, she said she was taking first aid courses at the county rec center, and I should come, because she suspected people were going to need a lot of first aid in the coming months. She was not wrong about that. The first aid class was run by a retired Army medic named Mike who had decided, with the pragmatic clarity of a man who had seen things go badly wrong at scale, that the most useful thing he could do with the time remaining was teach his neighbors how to stop a bleed and manage a fracture and keep someone breathing who had decided, for whatever reason, to stop. Mike was not optimistic. He was not pessimistic. He was prepared, which is a different thing, and he taught the way prepared people teach: no drama, no comfort, just the information you needed delivered at the pace your hands could absorb it. Daisy was good at the practical parts and patient with the people who weren't. I was good at the theory and slow with my hands, which Tom would have found hilarious. Tom had been the one with the hands. Tom had been the one who could rewire a piece of equipment, disassemble an engine, splice a graft with the precision of a surgeon. I was the one who read the manuals and then got in his way while he did it. Liz came to one session and left after 20 minutes because the instructor's approach to triage conflicted with something she'd read in a FEMA preparedness document. She went home and reorganized the farm's emergency supply inventory instead, which was more useful. The spires kept growing. By midsummer, there were 11 of them visible from our property. The ridge to the northeast was now a silhouette of dark lattice against the pale violet sky, and the northern fields, the ones closest to the first cluster, were producing nothing. My father walked those rows every morning and said nothing. He had stopped saying much by then. He had the look of a man who was doing precise and careful calculations in his head, adding up columns whose sum he already knew but wasn't ready to say out loud. I had my departure date, 7 years. People at the Exodus Initiative kept sending me updates, training schedules, medical appointment reminders. There was still a program. There were still ships being built, somewhere on the other side of the continent, in facilities that had not yet been compromised by spire proximity. The program was still real. My spot was still confirmed. I ran every morning. 6 miles along the county road, past the Kaufman place, back along the ridge trail where I could see the spires up close, the lattice of them, the dull, non-reflective surface that seemed to absorb light rather than scatter it, the faint, subsonic pulse you didn't hear so much as feel in your sternum. I ran because the program required it, and because running was the only time my mind went quiet. Some mornings Daisy ran with me. We didn't talk much on those runs. That was one of the things about her. She understood that some kinds of company are better without words. We would reach the high point of the ridge trail, where the nearest spire was close enough that you could see the internal channels pulsing in low-frequency amber light, and we would stop and breathe and look at it, and then we would turn around and run back. One morning she said, without preamble, "What was his name?" "Tom," I said. She nodded. We ran back in silence. I told my father about the departure date in August. He was in the north greenhouse, hand-pruning the roses that had survived the soil shift by virtue of being in raised beds with imported substrate. He listened without turning around. When I finished, he set down the pruning shears and looked at the plants for a while. 7 years, he said. That's the training cycle. He picked up the shears again. Your grandfather built this greenhouse in 1987, used to say he built it for the ones who came after. That was all he said. Liz cornered me that evening in the equipment barn and told me at length and with considerable precision what she thought of the Exodus Initiative, its actuarial prospects, its leadership, and my decision-making capacity. She was not wrong about any of it. The program's legitimacy was genuinely questionable, a private venture, underfunded, facing logistical realities that its promotional materials glossed over. I knew this. I had known it when I signed. I had signed anyway. "You're running," she said. "From what?" "You know from what." I did. Dr. Olson came on a Tuesday in late August and walked the North Fields with my father for 2 hours. When she came back to the kitchen, she sat down and told us that the soil chemistry in those fields had shifted beyond any correction she knew how to make. The pH was wrong. The mineral composition was wrong. The microbial populations that all agriculture depends on, the quiet, invisible infrastructure of the ground, were collapsing, not dying exactly, changing into something else. Something that supported a different kind of growth. She had soil samples from 14 farms in the county. It was the same in all of them, starting from the spire proximity zones and moving outward at a rate of roughly 3 meters per week. "How long?" my father asked. She looked at her hands. "For this property, 2 years, maybe 3 if the southern fields hold." My father nodded. He thanked her. He walked her to her truck. He stood in the drive and watched her go. Then he went back into the greenhouse and I didn't see him again until dinner. It was around this time that we began to understand, in a practical rather than theoretical sense, what the architects actually were. A team from the university had gotten close to one of the interior structures, not a spire but what appeared to be a relay node, a smaller lattice unit that had emerged between 2 spires on the eastern ridge. They had good shielding, good equipment, and 3 weeks of preparation. They got within 40 meters before the equipment started failing, but they got enough. High-resolution imaging, spectrographic analysis. And one piece of data that the team leader, a materials scientist named Vasquez, described in her report as, quote, the most disturbing thing she had ever seen. The lattice was alive. Not in the way we use that word loosely. Alive in the technical, cellular sense, metabolizing, replicating, maintaining internal homeostasis. The channels that pulsed with amber light were circulatory. The structures were not built. They were grown from seed structures planted deep in the crust by an organism that operated on geological timescales and did not have anything we would recognize as a brain or a nervous system or an intention. The architects were not architects in any purposeful sense. They were more like coral, vast colonial organisms following the encoded logic of their biology, expanding, altering their environment, indifferent to whatever had been living there before. Vasquez's report ended with a single sentence that I read 3 times before I understood what it meant. There is no one to negotiate with. September. The Exodus Initiative sent a notice that departure had been moved forward, not 7 years, 18 months. The situation on the ground had prompted a reassessment. The ships would be ready sooner. The life support systems would be, and I remember this phrase exactly, adequate for the journey with acceptable margin. I was to report for intensive training in November. I sat with that letter for a long time. My mother found me in the equipment barn that evening. She did not ask about the letter. She had read it, I knew, because she read everything that came into the house, a habit from the years she'd managed the books, a need to know all the variables before they became surprises. She sat down on the workbench beside me. "Tom wanted to stay," she said. "In the end, he wasn't sure you knew that." I didn't say anything. "He was scared, but he wanted to stay." She looked at her hands. "He used to say the thing about space was that it was safe. Nothing unexpected could happen because there was nothing there. He said that wasn't a reason to go somewhere. He said it was a reason to be afraid of it." I thought about Tom for a long time after that, about the way he'd talked about the farm, not with my father's silent reverence, but with something more like frustration. The frustration of someone who cared about a thing and couldn't find the words for the caring. He had wanted to expand the operation, had wanted to try grafting techniques he'd read about, new cultivar development, export markets. He had wanted a future for it. He had been 28 years old and full of plans. And then he was gone, and I had transferred all my own plans somewhere past the orbit of Mars and called it rational. I went to find Daisy. She was at the Kaufman place on the porch, watching the light on the northern ridge. The spires were lit from within now at dusk. The amber pulse brightened at sunset, tracking something in the electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes registered only as a deepening of the violet tint to the air. I sat down beside her and told her about the letter, 18 months. She was quiet for a while, then, "Are you going?" "I've been asking myself that." "What does it feel like when you think about going?" I thought about it honestly, like putting something down that I've been carrying for a long time. "And what does it feel like when you think about not going?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the ridge, at the lattice against the sky, at the amber light moving in slow, purposeful patterns through structures that had been growing beneath our feet for longer than any of us had been alive. "Like picking something up," I said finally. She nodded. "Those are different things." I knew that. What changed, what actually changed the calculation, was not any single moment. I want to say it was the thing with the greenhouse, because that's the part that's easiest to explain. But the truth is it had been accumulating for months, the way soil changes, by increments too small to see until suddenly the crop fails and you realize the ground has been something different for a long time. The greenhouse incident, October, 2 weeks before I was supposed to drive to the training facility. One of the spires had extended a secondary structure overnight. Not a new spire, a lateral growth, a tendril of lattice running along the ground from the base of the northeastern cluster toward the farm. It came in under the fence line, through 6 inches of topsoil, and emerged in the floor of the north greenhouse, pushing up through the concrete pad in a clean hexagonal fracture that none of us heard happen. My father found it at 5 in the morning. He stood in the greenhouse doorway for a long time, looking at it. I found him there when I came back from my run. The secondary structure was small, 30 centimeters tall, the same dull lattice material, already pulsing faintly. It had grown through the concrete the way roots grow through concrete, not forcefully but inexorably, finding the path of least resistance, following the logic of its own expansion. My father said nothing. He picked up his pruning shears and walked toward it. "Dad," I said. He looked at me. "It won't matter," I said. "You can't cut it." "I know," he said, and he kept walking. He stood in front of it and looked at it the way he looked at a plant he was trying to understand, not with anger, not with fear, just with the focused attention of a man whose skill was reading living things. He studied it for several minutes. Then he did something that I did not expect. He reached out and touched it. The pulse under his hand changed, not dramatically. A slight shift in frequency, a brightening of the amber in the channels nearest his palm, as if it had registered his presence the way a plant registers light, not with awareness, not with intention, but with response. He stood there for a while, then he took his hand back and walked out. I followed him. "What did you feel?" I asked. He thought about it. "Warm," he said, "like soil in July." We stood in the early light and looked at the ridge, the spires, the secondary structure visible through the greenhouse glass. "I'm not going," I said. He looked at me. "I'm not going to the training facility. I'm not taking the spot." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "You sure?" "No," I said honestly, "but I'm not going." He nodded. He looked back at the greenhouse. "We'll need to figure out what to do about the floor." That was all he said. I called the Exodus Initiative and released my slot. The coordinator on the phone asked me 3 times if I was certain, with the kind of careful neutrality that meant he'd had this conversation before and knew better than to push. I told him I was certain. He said the slot would be reassigned within 72 hours. He thanked me for my time. I stood in the barn after the call and waited to feel something, relief, regret, the weight of a door closing. What I felt instead was a kind of clarification, like a heading locked in after a long period of drift. Dmitri found me there. He had clearly been listening from the next room, in the way he listened to things, not eavesdropping exactly, but present. "Good," he said. "You think so?" He shrugged. "I think you were never going to Mars. I think you knew that." He picked up a broken hoe handle and examined the split. "I think you were just waiting for a reason that was bigger than the one you were running from." I didn't argue with him. What followed was not heroic in the way stories make things heroic. It was slow and technical and often dull and punctuated by failures that cost us badly. I want to be clear about the costs. Dr. Olson brought us a research paper in November. University of Colorado, peer-reviewed before communications fully degraded, about the architect's biology. The colonial organism operated through electromagnetic signaling between units. The amber pulse in the channels was essentially a nervous system, distributed across thousands of structures across the planet, coordinating their activity the way neurons coordinate muscle movement. The modification of local atmospheric chemistry was a byproduct of their metabolic processes, not a weapon. They were exhaling. What the paper also noted was that colonial organisms of this type were sensitive to disruption of the signaling network. A human nervous system tolerates the loss of individual neurons. It does not tolerate interference with the signals between them. The question was whether anything we could generate at the scale available to us would constitute meaningful interference. Liz read the paper twice and spent 3 days with a legal pad and a calculator. Then she came to dinner and presented a proposal that was, in its essential logic, the most practical thing I'd heard since the architects arrived. She had mapped the signal pulse frequencies from the data in the paper. She had calculated the power requirements for generating a counter-frequency signal in the RF range. She had determined that the equipment needed high-power RF emitters, the kind used in agricultural pest management systems, was available through the county co-op. "We can't stop them," she said, "but we might be able to slow them down, disrupt local coordination, buy time." "Time for what?" I asked. "Time," she said, "just time. Someone will figure out what to do with it." She was not optimistic. She was prepared. It ran in the family. Mike joined us. He had contacts, military, retired, living in the area, men who had been waiting with quietly organized supplies for something they could actually do. They came to the farm in 2s and 3s over the following weeks. They were not young. Most of them were my father's age or older. They had the careful, unhurried competence of people who had long since stopped confusing speed with effectiveness. We built the first array in December, mounted on the water tower at the south end of the property, powered by the farm's diesel generator and a bank of car batteries that Dimitri acquired through a chain of transactions I decided not to ask too many questions about. The array was not elegant. It was heavy-gauge wire and salvaged components, and 3 weeks of trial and error, and more than one conversation, where Liz and I disagreed loudly about approach, before Dimitri suggested a third option that was better than either. The night we switched it on, the northern spires went dark for 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Then the pulse returned, shifted slightly in frequency, the organism adapting. But for 4 minutes the amber light went out of the lattice channels, and the air pressure near the structures dropped by 2 millibars, and 3 of the plants in the north greenhouse flowered. Not died. Flowered. My father stood in the greenhouse in the dark and watched them. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We adjusted the frequency. We built a second array. We shared the design with Dr. Olson, who shared it with 14 other farms and 3 county emergency operations centers within range. They built their own. The disruptions were brief and the organism adapted each time, but adaptation took energy, took processing, slowed the rate of soil modification in the affected zones. 3 meters per week became 2 meters per week in the active areas. The northern fields were still dead. The southern fields held. Daisy ran first aid out of the barn through the winter. Mike helped. She had the systematic patience for it and the ability to explain things to people who were frightened in a way that settled them rather than wound them tighter. She organized supply chains, coordinated with the county shelter network, drove a delivery route twice a week through conditions that made that inadvisable. She was not built for any of this. Neither was any of us. We did it because it was there to be done. January. The architects extended 3 more secondary structures under the property. We stopped trying to remove them. Instead, Dmitri had the idea of monitoring their pulse patterns directly, placing contact sensors on the structures, and logging the frequency data. The colonial organism used the secondary structures as local relays. If you knew the local pulse pattern, you could tune the counter frequency more precisely. He spent 2 weeks on the contact sensors, working in the greenhouse at 4 in the morning because the spires were quietest before dawn, not silent, never silent, but the amplitude of the pulse was lower and the adaptation response was slower. He built the sensors from accelerometers and a microcontroller he sourced from a broken piece of farm equipment. He was very precise about it. He did not have an engineering background. He had the patience of someone who had learned that most problems yielded if you stayed with them long enough. By February, we had the local pulse pattern mapped to within 3% accuracy. The array on the water tower was operating at near-optimal counter frequency. The expansion had slowed to less than 1 meter per week in our zone. 1 meter per week was still killing us, but the rate of killing had changed. That was worth something. I ran every morning. The ridge trail was compromised now. The secondary growth had spread along it, lattice threading through the soil like root systems, and the pulse near the surface of the trail was strong enough to give you a headache if you ran it for more than 20 minutes. I ran a different route. I was slower than I had been. I was tired in the way you are tired when the work does not end, when every solved problem reveals 2 more, when the wins are measured in days and the losses in acres. Some mornings Daisy ran with me. She did not talk much on the runs. She understood what the silence was for. One morning in March she said, "Do you ever think about what they want?" "They don't want anything," I said. "That's the point." "I know, but I keep trying to find the logic. They're changing the planet for what? What comes next?" I had thought about this. Vasquez's research suggested the colonial organism underwent a reproductive phase once planetary modification reached a certain threshold, releasing seed structures that would travel through space on solar wind until they found another suitable substrate. The planet was not a target. It was a nursery. The architects would complete the modification, reproduce, and disperse, leaving behind an atmosphere that supported their biology but not ours, and eventually a new cycle would begin somewhere else. "A nursery," I said. "They're making a nursery." She ran with that for a while. "And we're what? Weeds?" "We're nothing. We're not even weeds. We just happen to be here." We ran. "That," she said after a while, "is actually the most infuriating thing I've ever heard." And I found myself laughing, for the first time in a long time, running along a route I'd never planned to run, on a planet that was trying to become something else, laughing because she was right. Not the horror of malice, not the comprehensible brutality of conquest, but the absolute indifference of a process that did not know we existed. We were going to slow it down anyway. Not because we could win. We knew we couldn't win, not the way war movies mean winning. The organism was too large, too distributed, too old. Our counter-frequency arrays were local, effective, local, and finite. We were buying time and we knew it, and we kept doing it because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something any of us had decided to do. The spring planting, I should say, was my father's idea. The southern fields were clear. The soil was not good. The boundary of the modification zone was visible at the property line, a distinct change in color and texture that you could walk along like a shoreline, but it was still alive, still capable. My father proposed that we plant everything, not just the commercial cultivars. Everything in storage, every seed packet in the barn, every cutting in the greenhouse, the heritage varieties and the experimental grafts, and the ones Tom had been developing before he died. All of it. Liz said it was not the most efficient use of our resources. My father looked at her for a moment. No, he agreed, it's not. We planted everything. Dmitri worked 18-hour days in April and May, and I worked alongside him, and my mother walked the rows each evening the way she walked the property line each morning, with the deliberate attention of someone who has decided that the thing in front of her is worth her full regard. Daisy came on weekends and planted with the methodical care of someone learning a new skill, asking questions with the particular focused curiosity of a person who has found something that matters to them. Liz worked the arrays. She had become, over the winter, genuinely expert in the counter-frequency systems, developing modifications to the original design that improved efficiency by 30% and extended the effective range. She was precise about it, systematic, not emotional. She was also, I noticed, spending a lot of time in the greenhouse, checking on the heritage roses. Our father noticed too. He didn't say anything. He started leaving the greenhouse lights on later. The fields came in. Not all of them. The boundary held where we expected it to hold, and the losses on the north end were real and final. But the southern fields produced. The roses, the dahlias, the experimental cultivars Tom had been working on, they grew. They grew in the altered light in the violet-tinted air, against the ambient pulse of the spires on the ridge, and they grew because the soil was still alive, and because we had done what farmers do, which is put seeds in the ground and attend to them. I stood in the south field in early June, in the good morning light before the tint of the atmosphere shifted the spectrum, and looked at what we had. It was not enough to save the farm in any commercial sense. The buyer's network had collapsed with the communications disruption. The export markets were a memory. We were growing flowers in a world that was becoming increasingly inhospitable to the idea of flowers, and the pace of the inhospitality was slow, but not slow enough. But they were there, in the ground, rooted. The Exodus initiative launched in August. I watched it on a small screen in the barn, the satellite feed cutting in and out, a dozen ships rising on a clear morning from a site in Nevada, small bright flames against the copper sky. One of those ships had a berth that had been mine. I watched them until the feed cut entirely, and then I went back to work. I don't have a neat ending for this. I'm sorry if you wanted one. What I have is this: the arrays held through the summer. The rate of expansion slowed. Dr. Olson's network had 31 stations operational by September, and the aggregate effect on the regional modification rate was measurable. Not decisive. Measurable. 1 meter per week became, in the protected zones, less than that. In some areas the boundary held entirely for weeks at a time. Vasquez published a second paper, routed through a relay network that some very careful people had kept functional, arguing that sustained electromagnetic disruption of the signaling network was creating detectable stress responses in the colonial organism, that it was, in effect, having to work harder to maintain its own coherence in the affected regions. The organism was not dying. It was not retreating, but it was working harder. And an organism working harder than its optimal rate produces errors, small ones, but errors. That was September. I don't know what happened after September in the larger sense, because I am telling you this from inside it, and what happens at the end of something is not visible from the middle. I know what happened at the farm. We harvested in October. The roses and the dahlias, and 3 of the experimental cultivars that Tom had been working on. The ones Liz had kept alive through the winter in the greenhouse. We bundled them and drove them to the county shelter network and the first aid stations, and left them there without explaining why, because some things are better left without explanation. On the drive back, my father said, Tom would have wanted to see those grow. Yes, I said. We drove. The light was that October light, thin and clear and honest about everything it touched, the way autumn light is, the way it doesn't soften anything but makes everything exact. I would have let you go, he said, if you'd needed to. I know. I'm glad you didn't need to. We did not say anything else. We drove back to the farm and walked the south field in the late afternoon, my father and I, the way he had walked it with his father and would have walked it with Tom, going row by row in the quiet way of men who have learned to say what matters by putting their attention on the same thing at the same time. The spires were on the ridge. The amber light was there, steady and inexorable and indifferent. We were still here. That for now is what I have to offer. A farm still standing, a field still rooted, a row of flowers on a changing planet, tended by people who decided, without any particular expectation of rescue, that tending was the thing to do. The stars are still up there. Some of the people I knew are on their way to them. I am here, with the soil under my hands and the pulse of something vast and unhurrying moving through the ground beneath my feet, and the peculiar, stubborn, entirely irrational conviction that the ground is worth standing on. We'll see who's right.